The last spell. The year was 1692, and the air in Salem village was thick with fear and suspicion. The witch trials had reached their peak, and the gallows were busy. Among the accused was a group of women who had long been whispered about in the shadows. They were not the kind of women who gathered at the church for Sunday sermons or who joined the other villagers in their daily chores. They were outsiders, women who knew the old ways, the ways of the earth, the ways of magic. On the eve of their execution, the women were held in a small, dark cell beneath the courthouse. The air was damp, and the only light came from a single flickering torch outside the iron bars. The women huddled together, their faces pale and drawn, but their eyes burned with a fierce determination. They knew they would not survive the dawn, but they were not ready to let their secrets die with them. "We must cast the spell," whispered one of the women, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind howling outside. Her name was Goody Ayres, and she was the eldest among them. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her hands were gnarled from years of hard work, but her voice carried the weight of authority. "If we do not, everything we have worked for will be lost." The other women nodded in agreement. They had all been part of a coven, a secret sisterhood that had practiced the old ways in secret, passing down their knowledge from mother to daughter for generations. But now, with the trials sweeping through the village like a plague, their time had run out. "We must protect the Grimoire," said another woman, her voice trembling. Her name was Mercy Hale, and she was the youngest of the group. She had only recently been initiated into the coven, and her fear was palpable. "If it falls into the wrong hands—" "It will not," interrupted Goody Ayres, her voice firm. "We will cast the spell, and the grimoire will be hidden. It will not be found until the time is right, until one of our own bloodline is ready to take up the mantle." The women gathered in a circle, their hands clasped tightly together. They began to chant, their voices low and steady, the words of the spell flowing from their lips like a river. The air in the cell grew heavy, and the torch outside flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. But they did not stop. They continued to chant, their voices growing louder, more powerful, until the very walls of the cell seemed to vibrate with the force of their magic. As the spell reached its climax, a blinding light filled the cell, and the women felt a surge of energy course through their bodies. They knew the spell had worked. The grimoire was safe, hidden away where no one would find it. But as the light faded and the cell returned to darkness, they also knew that the spell had done more than just protect their secrets. It had awakened something ancient and powerful, something that should have remained buried. The women exchanged uneasy glances, but there was no time to speak. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, and the door to the cell creaked open. The sheriff and his men had come to take them to the gallows. As they were led away, Goody Ayres cast one last glance over her shoulder, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew that the spell they had cast would have consequences that would ripple through the centuries. But she also knew that it was necessary. The grimoire had to be protected, no matter the cost. The women were hanged at dawn, their bodies left to sway in the cold morning breeze. But as the villagers returned to their homes, they could not shake the feeling that something had changed, that the air was different, heavier, as if the very fabric of reality had been altered. And in the shadows, something stirred. The grimoire unearthed. Centuries passed, and the Salem Witch Trials faded into history, becoming little more than a cautionary tale told to school children and tourists. The village of Salem grew into a town, and then a city, its dark past buried beneath layers of progress and modernity. But the spell cast by Goody Ayres and her coven had not been forgotten. It lingered, dormant but potent, waiting for the right moment to awaken. In the present day, the descendant of one of those witches, a young woman named Eliza Hawthorne, lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of Salem. Eliza was a historian, specializing in the colonial period, and she had always been fascinated by the witch trials. She had spent years researching her family tree, tracing her lineage back to one of the accused witches, Mercy Hale. Eliza had always felt a strange connection to her ancestor, as if Mercy's spirit was guiding her, urging her to uncover the truth. One crisp autumn afternoon, Eliza was sorting through a box of old documents she had inherited from her grandmother. The box had been sitting in her closet for years, untouched, but something had compelled her to open it that day. As she sifted through the yellowed papers and faded photographs, her fingers brushed against something hard and leathery. She pulled it out and stared at it in disbelief. It was a grimoire. The cover was made of cracked, weathered leather, and the pages were brittle with age. Eliza's heart raced as she carefully opened the book, her eyes scanning the intricate symbols and handwritten spells that filled its pages. She recognized some of the symbols from her research. They were the same ones used by the accused witches during the trials. Eliza's hands trembled as she turned the pages, her mind racing with questions. How had this grimoire ended up in her grandmother's possession? Why had it been hidden away for so long? And most importantly, what secrets did it contain? As she continued to read, Eliza felt a strange sensation wash over her, a tingling in her fingertips that spread up her arms and into her chest. It was as if the grimoire was alive, pulsing with a hidden energy. She could feel the power emanating from its pages, a power that was both intoxicating and terrifying. Eliza's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at her door. She jumped, startled, and quickly closed the grimoire, hiding it beneath a stack of papers. She took a deep breath to steady herself before opening the door. Standing on her doorstep was a man she had never seen before. He was tall and lean, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. His dark hair was streaked with silver, and he wore a long, black coat that seemed to blend into the shadows. "Eliza Hawthorne?" he asked, his voice smooth and low. "Yes," Eliza replied, her voice wavering slightly. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, but it was a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "My name is Nathaniel Blackwood. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Eliza's heart skipped a beat. "I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about." Nathaniel's smile widened, and he took a step closer. "The grimoire, Miss Hawthorne. I know you have it, and I must warn you, it is far more dangerous than you can possibly imagine." Eliza's mind raced. How did this man know about the grimoire? And what did he mean by dangerous? She took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the doorframe to steady herself. "I don't know what you're talking about," she repeated, her voice firmer this time. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Nathaniel's smile faded, and his eyes narrowed. "You don't understand, Miss Hawthorne. That grimoire is not just a book of spells. It is a key to something that should have remained buried. If you continue down this path, you will unleash a darkness that you cannot control." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to slam the door in his face, to shut out his ominous words, but something held her back. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was telling the truth, that the grimoire was more than just a relic of the past. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just leave me alone." Nathaniel studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, as if he had come to some decision. "Very well, Miss Hawthorne, but remember, you have been warned. The spell that protects that grimoire is still active, and it will not hesitate to destroy anyone who threatens its secrets." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. Eliza stood frozen in the doorway, her mind reeling. She closed the door slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She returned to the grimoire, her hands trembling as she opened it once more. The symbols and spells seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of her apartment, as if they were alive, waiting for her to unlock their secrets. Eliza knew she was standing on the precipice of something monumental, something that could change her life forever. But she also knew that she couldn't turn back now. The grimoire had chosen her, and she had no choice but to follow where it led. As she began to decipher the ancient text, she felt the tingling sensation return, stronger this time. It was as if the grimoire was speaking to her, guiding her hand as she traced the symbols with her fingertips. And then, without warning, the room was plunged into darkness. The air grew cold, and Eliza felt a presence, something ancient and powerful, watching her from the shadows. The spell was still active, and it was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The awakening, the darkness in Eliza's apartment was absolute, as if the very light had been sucked out of the room. She froze, her breath shallow, her fingers still resting on the grimoire's pages. The air grew colder, and she could feel a presence, something vast and ancient, hovering just beyond the edge of her perception. It was as if the room itself had come alive, the walls pressing in, the shadows shifting and writhing like living things. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had always been a rational person, a scholar who relied on facts and evidence. But this was beyond anything she had ever experienced. The grimoire seemed to pulse beneath her hands, its energy coursing through her like an electric current. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The room remained silent, but the presence seemed to grow stronger, more focused. Eliza's mind raced. She thought of Nathaniel Blackwood's warning, his cold, calculating eyes. He had known about the grimoire, known that it was more than just a book. And now, as the darkness pressed in around her, she began to understand why. The grimoire was not just a collection of spells. It was a vessel, a container for something far older and more dangerous than she could comprehend. The spell cast by Goody Ayres and her coven had not just hidden the book. It had bound something within it, something that had been waiting for centuries to be released. Eliza's instincts screamed at her to close the grimoire, to lock it away and never open it again. But another part of her, a deeper, more primal part, urged her to keep going. She felt a connection to the book, as if it were calling to her, demanding that she uncover its secrets. With trembling hands, she turned the page. The symbols on the parchment seemed to shift and swirl, forming patterns that made her head spin. She blinked, trying to focus, and as she did, the words began to make sense. It was as if the grimoire was translating itself for her, revealing its secrets in a language only she could understand. The spell was called the Last Binding. It was a ritual of immense power, designed to seal away a force so dangerous that even the witches who cast it feared its release. The grimoire described the force only as the Veil, a being that existed between worlds, neither fully alive nor dead, but eternally hungry. The Veil fed on fear, on chaos, and on the souls of those who dared to summon it. The witches of Salem had bound it within the grimoire, using their own lives as the final key to the spell. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She realized now why the grimoire had come to her. She was a descendant of Mercy Hale, one of the witches who had cast the spell. Her bloodline was the key to maintaining the binding or breaking it. As she read on, the presence in the room grew stronger. The shadows seemed to coalesce into a shape, a figure that loomed over her, its form shifting and indistinct. Eliza's hands shook, but she couldn't look away. The grimoire's pages seemed to glow with an eerie light, illuminating the figure before her. It was a woman, her features gaunt and hollow, her eyes burning with a cold, otherworldly fire. She wore the tattered remains of a colonial-era dress, and her hair hung in wild, unkempt strands around her face. Eliza recognized her at once. "Mercy," she whispered. The figure tilted her head, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice was a hollow echo, as if it came from a great distance. "You have awakened the grimoire," she said, "but you do not understand what you have done." Eliza's mind raced. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to learn the truth. About you, about the trials, about—" "The truth is a dangerous thing," Mercy interrupted. "The spell we cast was not just to protect our secrets. It was to protect the world from what lies within this book. The Veil is not just a force, it is a being, a predator. And it has been waiting for someone like you to set it free." Eliza's stomach churned. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to." "Intentions do not matter," Mercy said, her voice cold. "What matters is what you do now. The binding is weakening. The Veil is stirring. If it escapes, it will consume everything in its path." Eliza's mind raced. "What can I do? How do I stop it?" Mercy's form flickered, as if she were struggling to maintain her presence. The grimoire holds the key, but to use it, you must be willing to make a sacrifice. The spell requires blood, your blood. Only a descendant of the coven can strengthen the binding. Eliza's heart sank. What kind of sacrifice? Mercy's eyes bore into hers, filled with a mixture of pity and resolve. The spell demands a life. To strengthen the binding, you must give your own. Eliza staggered back, the weight of Mercy's words crashing down on her. She had always been drawn to the past, to the stories of her ancestors, but she had never imagined that she would be asked to give her life for them. The room seemed to spin around her, the shadows closing in. Before she could respond, Mercy's form began to dissolve, her voice fading into the darkness. The choice is yours, Eliza. But know this, if you do not act, the veil will escape, and the world will burn. With those final words, Mercy vanished, leaving Eliza alone in the darkness. The grimoire lay open before her, its pages glowing faintly. Eliza's hands trembled as she reached for it, her mind a whirlwind of fear and doubt. She thought of Nathaniel Blackwood, of his warning. He had known about the grimoire, known about the danger it posed. Was he trying to protect her, or was he after the power it contained? And what would happen if the veil escaped? Could she really stand by and let that happen? Eliza's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she struggled to make sense of it all. She had always been a seeker of truth, but now she was faced with a truth that could destroy her. The grimoire was more than just a book. It was a weapon, a prison, and a key, and it was up to her to decide how to use it. As she stared at the glowing pages, she felt a strange calm settle over her. She didn't know what she would do, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't ignore this. The grimoire had chosen her, and she had no choice but to see this through. With a deep breath, she closed the grimoire and tucked it under her arm. She needed answers, and there was only one place she could think to go. Salem. The shadows of Salem. Eliza stood at the edge of Salem, the town's historic streets stretching out before her like a labyrinth of secrets. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke. But beneath the picturesque surface, Eliza could feel something darker, something that had been waiting for her return. The grimoire, tucked securely in her bag, seemed to grow heavier with every step she took. She had come to Salem to find answers, to trace the footsteps of her ancestors and uncover the truth about the veil. But as she walked through the town, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows seemed to stretch longer here, the whispers of the past echoing in every corner. Her first stop was the Salem Witch Trials Memorial, a somber collection of stone benches engraved with the names of the accused. Eliza ran her fingers over the name Mercy Hale, her ancestor, and felt a pang of sorrow. Mercy had been just a young woman when she was hanged, her life cut short by fear and superstition. And now, centuries later, Eliza was being asked to make a similar sacrifice. She shook off the thought and continued her journey, heading toward the old Hale homestead. The house had been preserved as a museum, a relic of the past that now stood as a testament to the town's dark history. Eliza had visited it before, but this time felt different. This time, she wasn't just a curious historian. She was a descendant, a keeper of secrets. As she approached the house, she noticed a figure standing near the entrance. It was Nathaniel Blackwood, his tall, lean frame unmistakable even from a distance. He turned as she approached, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "I told you to stay away from the grimoire," he said, his voice low and edged with frustration. Eliza squared her shoulders, refusing to be intimidated. "And I told you I don't take orders from strangers. What are you doing here?" Nathaniel's expression softened slightly, but his gaze remained intense. "I'm trying to protect you, Eliza. The grimoire is not just a book. It's a weapon, and there are people who would do anything to get their hands on it." Eliza frowned. "People like you?" He shook his head. "No, people far worse than me. The veil is not just a danger to you, it's a danger to everyone. If it escapes, it will consume everything in its path. And there are those who would use its power for their own gain." Eliza studied him carefully, trying to gauge his sincerity. "How do you know so much about it?" Nathaniel hesitated, then sighed. "Because I've been searching for it for years. My family has a history with the veil. We've been trying to keep it contained, to prevent it from being unleashed. But the grimoire is the key, and it's been lost for centuries until now." Eliza's mind raced. If Nathaniel was telling the truth, then he might be the only person who could help her. But she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. "Why should I trust you?" she asked. Nathaniel's lips curved into a faint smile. "You shouldn't, but you don't have much of a choice. The veil is already stirring, and you're the only one who can stop it." Eliza's heart sank. She had hoped to find answers in Salem, but instead, she had only found more questions. And now, with Nathaniel's ominous warning hanging over her, she felt more lost than ever. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel's expression grew serious. "First, we need to find the source of the binding. The spell your ancestors cast was tied to a specific location, a place where the veil was first summoned. If we can find it, we might be able to strengthen the binding before it's too late." Eliza nodded, though her mind was still reeling. "And if we can't?" Nathaniel's gaze darkened. "Then we'll have to find another way to stop it. But that's a last resort." The two of them set off through the town, heading toward the outskirts where the forest began to creep in. As they walked, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and the air grew colder with every step. Finally, they reached a clearing deep in the woods. In the center stood a circle of stones, their surfaces worn smooth by time. Eliza recognized it at once. It was a ritual site, a place where the witches of Salem had once gathered to practice their craft. "This is it," Nathaniel said, his voice low. "This is where the veil was first summoned, and this is where the binding must be renewed." Eliza's heart pounded as she stepped into the circle. The air was thick with energy, and she could feel the grimoire pulsing in her bag. She pulled it out and opened it to the page describing the last binding. The symbols seemed to glow in the dim light, their meaning clear. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Nathaniel stepped closer, his expression grim. "You need to complete the ritual, but be warned, the veil will fight back. It will try to stop you, to break free. You must be strong." Eliza nodded, though her hands were shaking. She began to chant the words of the spell, her voice growing stronger with each syllable. The air around her seemed to vibrate, and the shadows in the clearing began to shift and writhe. As she reached the final lines of the spell, she felt a sudden, searing pain in her chest. She gasped, clutching at her heart, and fell to her knees. The grimoire slipped from her hands, its pages fluttering in the wind. Nathaniel rushed to her side, his face filled with concern. "Eliza, what's happening?" She couldn't answer. The pain was overwhelming, and she felt as if something was tearing at her very soul. The shadows in the clearing coalesced into a single massive form, a figure with hollow eyes and a gaping maw. It was the veil, and it was coming for her. Eliza's vision blurred, and she felt herself slipping away. But as darkness closed in around her, she heard Nathaniel's voice, faint but determined. "Hold on, Eliza. I won't let it take you." The final binding. Eliza's world was a blur of pain and darkness. The veil loomed over her, its form shifting and writhing like a storm made of shadows. She could feel its hunger, its desire to consume her, to break free from the binding that had held it for centuries. Her chest burned as if her very soul were being torn apart, and she could barely hear Nathaniel's voice over the roaring in her ears. "Eliza!" Nathaniel shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. He knelt beside her, his hands gripping her shoulders. "You have to finish the spell. You're the only one who can." Eliza's vision swam, but she forced herself to focus. The grimoire lay open on the ground in front of her, its pages glowing faintly. The symbols seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, urging her to continue. She reached out with trembling hands, her fingers brushing against the ancient parchment. The veil let out a deafening roar, its form surging forward. Nathaniel stood, placing himself between Eliza and the entity. He raised his hands, and a barrier of light erupted from the ground, holding the veil at bay. The effort was clearly draining him. His face was pale and sweat dripped from his brow, but he held firm. "Do it now, Eliza," he shouted, his voice strained. "I can't hold it for long." Eliza took a deep, shuddering breath and began to chant the final lines of the spell. Her voice was weak at first, but it grew stronger with each word. The pain in her chest began to recede, replaced by a strange, warm energy that flowed through her veins. The grimoire's pages glowed brighter, and the symbols seemed to lift off the parchment, swirling around her in a vortex of light. The veil shrieked, its form writhing as the light touched it. It lashed out at Nathaniel's barrier, cracking it in places, but he held on, his jaw clenched in determination. Eliza's voice rose, the words of the spell pouring out of her like a river. She could feel the power of the binding growing, weaving itself into the fabric of reality. The veil's form began to shrink, its edges dissolving into the light. But then, just as the spell reached its climax, the veil let out a final, desperate scream. It surged forward, shattering Nathaniel's barrier and slamming into Eliza. She felt a cold, suffocating darkness envelop her, and for a moment, she thought it was over. But then she heard Mercy's voice, faint but clear, echoing in her mind. "You are stronger than it. You are the key." Eliza's eyes snapped open, and she let out a cry of defiance. She slammed her hands down on the grimoire, and a burst of light erupted from its pages, engulfing the veil. The entity let out one final, ear-splitting scream before it was pulled back into the grimoire, its form dissolving into nothingness. The clearing fell silent. The light faded, and the grimoire's pages went still. Eliza collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion. Nathaniel rushed to her side, his face filled with relief. "You did it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You strengthened the binding." Eliza nodded weakly, her vision blurring. "But at what cost?" Nathaniel's expression darkened. "The spell required a sacrifice. Your life force is tied to the binding now. As long as you live, the veil will remain trapped. But if you die," Eliza's heart sank, "the binding will break." Nathaniel nodded. "Yes, but you've bought us time. And with time, we might find another way to contain it, permanently." Eliza closed her eyes, her mind reeling. She had saved the world from the veil, but at a terrible price. She was now the guardian of the grimoire, bound to it for the rest of her life. The weight of that responsibility was almost too much to bear. But as she lay there, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. And she knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same courage and determination. Nathaniel helped her to her feet, his grip firm but gentle. "Come on," he said. "We need to get out of here. There's still much to do." Eliza nodded, her strength slowly returning. She picked up the grimoire, its weight familiar now, and tucked it under her arm. Together, she and Nathaniel walked out of the clearing, leaving the shadows of Salem behind them. As they emerged from the forest, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. Eliza took a deep breath, the cool morning air filling her lungs. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She was ready to face it. The Witch Trials' last spell had been cast, and the secrets of the past had been protected. But the story was far from over, and Eliza Hawthorne, descendant of witches and guardian of the grimoire, would be at the center of it all.